1920s, or the Roaring Twenties, is an era decorated with technological developments, ambitious spending, xenophobic sentiments, scandalous behavior, and emerging cultural identities. During this dynamic decade, the United States saw a uniquely polarized economy, the emergence of an African-based music form, and the rise of celebrities to the entertainment industry. The dichotomous economy delivering prosperity to some and devastation to others, social contrasts in women's and immigrants' roles, the innovative yet discriminatory entertainment industry, and the emergence of jazz music as a cultural touchstone helped create the reputation of the 1920s as the Roaring Twenties. Backing up to the context of World War I, in a period characterized by a high demand for food, farmers were granted government subsidies in order to increase production, but after the war ended, agricultural monsters armed with a mechanized team of machinery and a nigh unlimited supply of fertilizer continued to cultivate a plethora of grown goods, leading to overwhelming surpluses and devastating debts. In the 1920s, many farmers mortgaged or sold their properties to keep up with the bills. The decade's conservative federal government, invoking the ideals of a laissez-faire economic policy, ultimately dealt the coup de grace to the struggling farmers. Contrarily, it was this same policy that promoted big business during the same era. This is where the dichotomy in the 1920s economy is observed. Prosperity was strongly biased to the middle and upper classes, many of whom took advantage of the unregulated business enterprise model set up under Harding and Coolidge. A new, non-maritime America was more than ready to boom, to enjoy the perks of modern life. Luxurious advancements in technology during the 1920s were not limited to just upper-class Americans. Now, almost every average American readily opened his wallets, taking advantage of any piece of technology that would raise his family's personal standard of living, whether he could afford it or not. Such includes the automobile, perhaps the most impactful piece of technology on the American life. It was the automobile industry of the Roaring Twenties that shocked the marketplace, drastically increasing the standards of living, degrees of freedom, and senses of personal achievement in the average citizen. The automobile, with its stylistic fashion and elegant nature, symbolic of true independence, instilled a sense of pride in one's possessions. In fact, the average citizen was so eager to feel that pride that he purchased almost everything on credit and layaway payment plans to avoid financial obstruction. However, these unstable financial practices centered the economy on a precarious bridge of non-existent credit and over-speculation until the very end of the decade when the ropes finally snapped and America plummeted into the depths of economic depression, one of the worst in its history. From the very beginning, the laissez-faire economy unequally distributed prosperity to the upper-class corporations while abandoning the lower-class farmers. The uniquely polarized economy allowed for huge technological industries to thrive, improving the standard of living of Americans. However, at the same time, those industries' products were mainly purchased through credit and accumulated debt. Where deregulation led to prosperity, it also led to devastation. Where mass production led to mass consumerism, it also led to economic depression. The contradictory patterns of the economic conditions during the 1920s exemplify the unpredictable aspects of the Roaring Twenties. The 1920s also provides evidence of some of the most impactful social contrasts symbolic of women's rights and the fight for women's rights soon to come in the latter half of the century. At this time, women were behaving more like men, and the men encouraged it. They danced the Charleston, flappers shortened their hair, Gibson girls participated in masculine athletics, women began to smoke, dress promiscuously, dance wildly, drink excessively. The women of the 1920s had made a remarkable impression on the era, fleeing from the bonds of Republican motherhood and for once entering the American stage not behind men, but alongside men. Although things were looking good for women, it was a different story for the immigrants. Americans also, once again, lapsed into their selfish, common xenophobic sentiments, angrily condescending on Polish, Italian, German immigrants coming to Ellis Island or neighboring districts. The intense nativism pushed Congress to pass legislation such as the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, restricting European immigration to 3%. Further restrictions were implemented on the European newcomers, and Asians were shut out altogether. Contrarily, Americans did not oppose, for example, Mexican immigrants, whose poorly paid but highly demanded bracero labor forces were, and still are, following crop harvest in the West. Although America, after years of isolationism following World War I, rejected the wave of new immigration from the Eastern Hemisphere, it contradictorily opened its arms to immigrants from the Western Hemisphere seeking agricultural work. The social conditions of the 1920s were marked by significant contrasts. Women in the previous century, encouraged back into the confines of their domestic role, were polar opposites of the risque image of the drinking and smoking roaring woman. Xenophobia towards immigrants exhibited in the 1920s was oddly contradictory as well. It was upheld when no self-serving benefits were evident, but it was waived when exploitation of their resources was promised. Ultimately, the profiles of these people were transformed into something independent for women and something exploited for immigrants. Perhaps the continually diversifying nation could be united with a common technological experience. Radios, televisions, and movies became increasingly more popular and, from there, completely innovated the concept of modern entertainment. KDKA, broadcasted from Pittsburgh, was the very first public radio station. Hollywood stars like Charlie Chaplin and Rudolph Valentino helped expand the motion picture industry and were some of the first true American celebrities made famous by the ubiquitous forms of technological communication. However, the entertainment industry was not solely confined to technology-based mediums. The community known as Lost Generation consisted of dozens of literary masters such as Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. The Lost Generation was also characterized by contemporary music styles as famous piano composers Aaron Copland and George Gershwin came onto the scene. Their new use of progressions and unpredictable chordal patterns were just one example of the innovative extravagance of the Roaring Twenties entertainment industry. But while the contemporaries were innovating music, Louisianans were inventing it. Perhaps the most iconic development of the Roaring Twenties is the jazz music style inspired by African rhythms and black spirituals. Starting down in New Orleans as an underground music style, it gained instant popularity among white listeners and was soon found in almost any New York City club. King Oliver, Jelly Roll, Cole Porter, Louis Armstrong, and Duke Ellington rocked the stages with their crafty rhythms and perplexing syncopation. These young, soulful musicians played to the beat of the Harlem Renaissance with a driving motivation, while their fellow black Harlem artists pursued different disciplines: Langston Hughes in poetry, Zora Neale Hurston in fiction, and Marcus Garvey in philosophy. The entertainment and arts industry molded the touchstones of American culture, but these developments did not come without their own contradictions either. Increasing opportunities for actors in the film industry was inherently restricted to just whites, as demonstrated by silent films such as The Jazz Singer featuring white actors doing blackface performances. On the technology circuit, the radio revolution that brought jazz music into the homes of countless Americans did not disclose the behind-the-scenes discrimination originally resulting from the emergence of jazz. Black musicians encouraged to compose were required to give their music to white musicians for performance purposes. Unceasing development in the entertainment and arts industries did not erase discrimination. In fact, it may have even rekindled some anti-African sentiment. Innovative entertainment and the emergence of jazz initially exposed unstable racial conditions during the Roaring Twenties, exhibiting the period's inconsistent and contradictory moral/ethical standpoints. But once dynamism kicked in, the white majority began to idolize their favorite black authors and musicians and contemn the racist blackface character. In all, the entertainment and arts industries demonstrate the sense of innovation associated with the Roaring Twenties. Broadcasters, actors, authors, and musicians alike emerged from the least expected places, doing the least expected things, and achieving enormous success because of their innovative styles. Throughout the climactic and eventful decade of the 1920s, the economic conditions, social conditions, and arts and entertainment developments were characterized by extreme contradiction in action, policy, and opinion. The dichotomous laissez-faire economy, social contrasts in women's and immigrants' roles, the innovative yet discriminatory entertainment industry, and the evolution of jazz music from being composed by black musicians to being performed by black musicians all represent this contradiction. It was that contradiction that made the decade so unstable, so ever-changing, so dependent on the moment, so roaring. There is a single term commonly associated with jazz music which succinctly and appropriately describes the conditions of the Roaring Twenties, and that word is improvisation. From the contradictory laissez-faire economy to women redefining contrasting perspectives of morality to the true black musicians actually soloing unwritten melodies. America practiced their improvisation in 1920, and 10 dynamic years later emerged more knowledgeable, more cultured, and more united than ever before, which would prove crucial in the grueling decade to come.